On this show, I discuss the symbolic causes behind our collective and individual life paths, or the way we forge our destiny with our thoughts, and how our thoughts are influenced by symbols. For example, astrological influences, names, dates, you have it. Basically anything in our reality comes together as a symbol, and some of these are more general than others, like astrology. As a result, the astrological influence, or life energy, which operates through our body channels, affects our mind. And our thoughts are actually much mightier than people imagine them to be. They are able to cause physical effects through attraction. As we've discussed on the show before, many events in the world you can observe pretty much every day involve bizarre coincidences, which are not random. They could be technically called coincidences, but not random coincidences. The reason why these things come together is because of the suggestive power of the symbolisis, or the coming together of the portions of the symbol into a whole. Now, what I was discussing last time on the program on Thursday is that currently a big problem going on in the world is that there is the influence of the age of Aquarius. The age of Aquarius has been described in kind of positive terms. They kind of focus on the positive and not on the negative aspect. Every astrological influence is neutral, the age of Aquarius included, but there is a tendency toward excess in it as well as a tendency toward balance. The age of Aquarius tends toward balance when it's combined with the martial. It then tends toward the solar. The meaning of that is that when it's combined with the mentality of retention and bond and love and community and so forth, it results in getting rid of the bad and refining to the essence. So it's positive influence for cultivation. But when it combines with the lunar, or the desire for relief, the desire to get rid of the bad, it increases that because it's of that nature. The result is that in our world since 1844, with the beginning of the age of Aquarius, we see a general increase in fanatical groups that want to wash away traditions and eliminate cultures, destroy boundaries and borders, basically erase entire civilizations out of a delusional belief that throwing the baby out with the bathwater is a good idea. Basically, they delusionally see only the negative in our traditional society and in culture. They think that nationalism is the cause of racism and war, etc., and so they want to get rid of it for whatever reason. That's the Marxist side of it. That's more what we see in the West. In the East, there's more this tendency toward religious fanaticism. Because in general, the West is more materialistic in its thinking and the East is more spiritual. As a result, for instance, Islamist extremists see themselves on a mission to destroy everything which is impure and ungodly in the world. Unfortunately, they also are possessed by this ill-dignified lunar tendency to want to erase everything and throw the baby out with the bathwater. And as I have said on this program before, they are also plagued with heresies. The big problem here that led to these groups developing into what they are is that they're not really based on the pure teaching of the prophets to begin with. This is the case with irrational academic ideologies like Marxism. This is also the case, however, with most forms of Islam. And Christianity as well. Christianity behaved in a similar fashion, but for slightly different reasons back in the early Middle Ages, again, because of heresies. Because the original teaching of Emmanuel was corrupted by, and yes, his name was Emmanuel, or Yimmanuel, not Jesus. That was a later name given to him. The original name was Emmanuel, and later he went by the name Isa when he lived in. He actually survived the crucifixion. You see, here's the thing is, people always think in this kind of magical terms. They believe in things like miracles, things that simply don't exist. There's no such thing as a miracle. There's only laws of nature, and some things you're not able to understand or explain. That doesn't mean it's a miracle. The real meaning of miracle, all right? A miracle is fundamentally, or in German, ein Wunder, is just something you don't understand, something which baffles you. So Emmanuel's survival of the crucifixion was baffling to those who were around at the time because they thought he must have been dead. He'd been speared in the side, tortured, etc., starved. But he survived, and we know he survived because his grave is still there in Srinagar in Kashmir, India. Yes, Emmanuel survived the crucifixion and went to India. This is a fact. You can read all about it. Just look up Emmanuel Srinagar, Srinagar, in Kashmir. His grave is still there. In Kashmir, he was known by the name Isa. Now, why did he flee all the way to North India? The answer is that his teaching was more in line with certain teachers in India than with the Pharisees. His teaching taught spiritual evolution, consciousness, freedom, etc., whereas the Pharisees were more of a slavish cult. They wanted to have their followers simply obey them. And that was their big problem with Emmanuel, is that he threatened their authority. He was smarter than they were. He was wiser. His teaching was truer than theirs was, and so they wanted to get rid of him. And so they tried to kill him. He was a master of certain meditative techniques whereby a person can go into a stasis and appear dead. So that was his method for escaping the Pharisees, is he appeared as though he simply gave up the ghost and died. But he wasn't dead. He was in a state of deep meditation or hibernation. See, if you actually completely die, you can't come back to life. It's completely impossible. It's impossible once you're dead to come back to life. You have to have your spirit form in your body. You have to still have some kind of basal function going on. Because if you are 100% brain dead, there is no coming back. It's impossible. At that point, your spirit form is already gone and your personality is already being demolished or destroyed in the afterlife to be replaced by a new one. So he did not die, right? He did not resurrect. That's a mistaken translation. He simply stood up again or came back to active life or reanimated, but he did not come back to life from the dead. Now, there's a lot of different aspects to this in the spirit teaching, which will help you understand what really happened here. But in general, again, miracles are not real. There's no such thing as a miracle. So just because something is not able to be explained does not, by any given individual or theory, does not mean first of all, doesn't mean it's not real, and secondly, doesn't mean that it's a miracle. All that the word miracle means is that you refuse to understand the actual cause, because the cause can be explained. In Emmanuel's case, there are examples, for example, of Buddhist monks that meditate in such a deep state that they appear dead, a kind of hibernation. Some monks have even developed the ability to slow their bodily processes so much that they are able to gradually dehydrate as they die and mummify themselves by dehydration. As they're actually alive during this full period of dehydration while sitting, for example, in the lotus position. There's an example of a monk in Russia who did this to himself. That's kind of what Emmanuel did. He went into a state of hibernation, but he did not die. So right there, we have already the basis to understand that there is a great heresy in Christianity which says that Jesus died, went to hell, and came back, when actually he just escaped to India. Now, in India, he was known as Isa, right? He taught there as well, and he also was not a bachelor. He had children. He had descendants. In fact, he probably has thousands or millions of descendants now, all throughout India, the Middle East, Europe. And there's nothing special about these either. There's a lot of nonsense written about some Jesus bloodline with Mary Magdalene or whatever. None of that happened. Mary Magdalene was not his spouse. He didn't have some royal bloodline descended from him. It's all nonsense. In reality, he was a human being and he had human descendants. That's it. But he did live in India to a very old age. And this is another thing, is that because of the meditative techniques he practiced and because of his general knowledge of health and herbal medicine, etc., he was able to live to the age of over 110 or something like that, or 130 even, some say. So, clearly the man had massive knowledge and wisdom. But in order to make use of that knowledge and wisdom, we have to understand it. We can't just ascribe everything to a miracle, because it wasn't miracles. What Jesus did, or what Emmanuel did, was all based on his knowledge. And his knowledge came from his consciousness, right, or spirit. That's why he told people not to pray in a kind of in a kind of pretentious way, not to go out and wail and pretend you're fasting and you want everyone to see you're fasting. He told you to pray essentially to your own spirit. In current forms, that's usually represented as the Heavenly Father or whatever. Originally, he just said the Holy Spirit, or Ruah, the Spirit, which means consciousness, basically. Essentially, any real prayer is directed at your own consciousness or your own innermost self, which is in connection with God or the creation, the universal consciousness. This is where miracles come from, right? Is that there are secret powers of our own consciousness which are accessible through things like prayer, meditation, and so forth. But it's dangerous to ascribe this to something other than the one universal consciousness and its universal laws. This is where the idea of what's traditionally called monotheism comes in. Now, it's not really a correct term because the universal consciousness is not a god, right? The way that these powers of thought influence our reality is according to universal laws of nature. What it really is the laws of nature created out of the absolutum. The laws of nature are what allow us, or the laws of creation, right? Of creation, or the universal consciousness, or God. Now, God with a capital G is not to be confused with the idea of God with a lowercase g. God with a lowercase g refers only to a mythological figure, a personification, an allegory. In general, that's what it means, right? You look at the Egyptian gods or whatever, those are just the equivalent of a fable, basically, in order to represent something. But they aren't necessarily objects of worship. What the objects of worship form of polytheism, or whatever you might call it, somewhat incorrectly, is actually quite often, even in monotheism, what I've described before, this phenomenon of becoming taken over by something which is opposed to the laws of creation, something which is trying to take the place of God, or which is, in other words, like what you might call a demon or a Satan or something. But understand, those things are creations of human beings. We create such things in our own mind. God did not create evil. That's the solution to the problem of evil is that God did not create evil. Humans create Satan. It's part of our own subconscious or our own consciousness. It's created by our own illogical thinking. That's why it's called traditionally anti-logos, or the anti-logic. Because what it does is it creates these consciousness forms, or apparent entities that really only are able to operate through us, right, or the whisperings of devils, or whatever you want to call them. But these things, called, for example, in Arabic, jinn, right, are just really the creations of our own thoughts and depend on us in order to exist. They are parasites on humanity. Because they don't have an independent existence. There's no independent existence for these creatures. But this is a good metaphor for explaining things like collective negative behavior, including cultism. And that's what I think is going on with a lot of these cults, is a lot of them are only semi-consciously, maybe subconsciously for the most part, influenced by such collective subconscious entities which embody the beliefs that their cult has, the false beliefs. Whether it's, and this I think is the reason why, for example, ISIS is not satisfied just to convert people to Islam or to spread their culture or to establish an orderly state as an example of the functionability of Islamism, but rather they go around and kill people, right? They go around and kill anybody who disagrees with them. The question is, what benefit does it bring to kill random civilians that happen to believe in something slightly different than you or something different than you? The answer, I think, is that these entities are like life forms in our collective subconscious, and they are in competition with other life forms, just like happens in nature. They're in competition for resources, and the resource is the humans which believe in them. They are threatened by other belief systems and cultures. You see, this is where you can distinguish people who are actually worshiping God from people who are worshiping a demon. no matter what they call it, they can call it Allah or Jesus Christ or whatever, if they are worshiping something and then they behave in such a way that they are clearly trying to exterminate believers in a different form of religion or culture, that is because they've been taken over by a demonic entity that is in competition with other demonic entities. Because there's no unity in hell. You see, there's no unity. These creatures are all in competition with each other. They're just like viruses or like animals. The beast, you see, the beast 666. That's why, I think that's the reason why Baghdadi goes around killing so mercilessly. Because he's not really worshiping God. The most Muslims, I think, are just worshiping God. They might have their own culture and their own notion and their own views, which might differ somewhat from ours, but fundamentally they're just worshiping creation, although they have some mistaken ideas about it, right? The thing is that Baghdadi's not worshiping creation at all. He's actually possessed. And the way I can determine this is partly by looking at his astrology. Astrologically, he's somebody who is extremely lunar, somebody who is so far to the hate and elimination mentality that naturally it creates a dichotomy in his psyche. I think what happened here is part of his mind that he has repressed through his extreme fanaticism has broken away and become an alter ego. And this alter ego has grown and gradually taken over Baghdadi as its slave. Unfortunately, because of the nature of this entity, it is part of a collective with other like-minded viruses of the mind, you might say. This creature, naturally, however, because it's the result of severe repression due to his predominant mentality of extreme hatred and fear, paranoia, and hate and desire to eliminate things, it has to be the exact opposite, you see. Baghdadi's demon is the exact opposite of him in mentality. This is a predator-prey relationship in which he is the prey and his demon is the predator. Now, it's using him and other self-sacrificing people who want to have a suicidal mentality, to destroy competition for its system or its slavery. It is not God. All right? Baghdadi might think, his followers think he's a Muslim worshiping God. All right, he's a Muslim, but that's just a religion, right? What he's worshiping is not God. And as I said, it's the opposite of his mentality, which means that it is extremely martial. The opposite of him being a relatively cowardly, bookish, quiet, mild-mannered, self-sacrificing fanatic. The antithesis is this merciless warlord, this fiery monstrosity, also known as the beast, right? The beast. Now, here's the thing, is that there are many different forms of this. This manifests not just in him, but in Christians, so-called Christians, like Ted Cruz, many different forms. Essentially, these jinn or demonic entities are all either of a fiery or watery nature because of the way that they're developed. But in his case, you can imagine it's like a kind of hungry predator, like a lion or a tiger or something, which is just out for blood. And it's using him and other like-minded people as its minions. You can observe this when you pay attention to the meticulous, superhuman combination of symbolic coincidences in many of the events here. Yes, I think there is some amount of attempted occultism and some amount of attempted calling card laying, but for the most part, what's going on with ISIS is not just driven by conscious deliberation. It is an irrational force, highly intelligent but irrational, which is able to bring about events in an almost magical or miraculous way. And this is yet another reason why you should not believe in miracles, is that there are such things as so-called miracles that are not brought about by good, but by schizophrenia, by what's going on with Baghdadi, psychokinesis, where a person has split their mind, and the split part of the mind has apparently magical powers to find secret knowledge, to activate secret forces, also known as demonic possession, right? That's traditionally what it's called, although I don't know if an exorcism would ever work on that guy. So we have to understand, we really do not wrestle against flesh and blood here, but against principalities and powers. And what's really behind Baghdadi is something which is not isolated to any individual. So killing him or killing them is not going to solve the problem per se. If you kill one of the leaders, then a new head will pop up. It's like the Hydra. You can't just kill him and expect to get results. Well, let's see. The show is going to be coming up here at the break in a second. So I'll give you my website. First of all, is MatthewDeagle.com. That's MatthewDeagle.com. Also, if you have any questions you want to ask me on the air, you can call in at 844-769-2944. That's 844-769-2944. And again, my website is MatthewDeagle.com. You can find personal astrological consultations on there, as a which I will do various different forms. You'll see the information under the products on my website, MatthewDeagle.com. After the break, I'll get into more about the history of Islam and how this kind of mentality develops in so-called religious people, both Muslims and Christians as well as Jews, and pretty much any religious fanatics can succumb to this kind of satanic influence. But the show's going to be coming up to the break here. Again, if you're interested in checking out my website, that's MatthewDeagle.com, MatthewDeagle.com. And let's see here. So again, just stay tuned. Back to Real Astrology with Matthew Deagle. I'm your host, Matthew Deagle. Before the break, I was discussing the phenomenon which is traditionally called demonic possession, and how this really is a collective subconscious force or power created by us, which acts like an animal and wants its slaves to destroy the slaves of other such creatures, since they are in competition with each other for survival, but they really don't care about our survival. This is the great danger in false religion, or false thinking, really, because it's independent of religion. You see these kinds of people in every religion, and you see these kinds of entities disguised as every kind of religious figure or prophet, including Jesus, not just Allah or whatever. This happens due to an extreme imbalance in the psyche. Now, the way you find out about these symbols in general is you have to observe nature, and you have to observe nature holistically. Theoretically, it's possible eventually for scientists to find out about these things by constructing and deducing, but really it'll take them a lot longer than is convenient if they don't look at the whole. For example, just looking at the whole, we can see what happens when the water element goes to extreme excess. The sea, the ocean, salt water. When water goes to extreme excess, it begins to become like its opposite, the earth. It begins to become inhospitable to human life, undrinkable, etc. The same thing with earth, however. When earth goes into extreme excess, it begins to become like its opposite, water. The desert, the Sahara, for example, is extreme earth element, yet it waves around in dunes just like the ocean. This is fundamentally what's going on in the minds of these people like Baghdadi. Their mind is so twistedly far toward one extreme that it begins to attract the opposite kind of energy. And this is dangerous. That's just a natural balancing tendency in nature, but it's very dangerous when it becomes a dichotomy. Because what that means is Baghdadi is ruled, he's an extremely lunar person full of hatred, fanaticism, the desire to eliminate what he sees as evil or bad or impure. Yet he is possessed by and ruled by an entity which is the exact opposite, a ruthless martial warlord. This is the same thing that's going on with Marxism in the West. Cultural Marxism and all these naive New Age types that are telling us that multiculturalism is good and the cause of our problems is nationalism, etc. They are ultimately, as you can observe holistically, being governed by a similar collective subconscious fiery force, or fiery demon, also known as 666, the Beast 666 system, or totalitarian enslavement and world domination. That is what they are being possessed by. You can observe right now that their mentality is ultimately leading to a surveillance state, to totalitarian tagging of human beings like cattle with the so-called mark of the beast, etc. And this is, again, all resulting from the exact opposite mentality, this extreme desire to eliminate systems that they see as restrictive or negative traditions, is going to result in the exact opposite, a system which is yet more restrictive than anything before. Similar thing with Baghdadi. He's trying to purify the world of what he sees as satanic or as infidel, etc. And the result is he's actually fueling the fire for this totalitarian system, or what is prophesied as the Dajjal, the false Messiah. He is himself helping to bring that about. Because these people are unknowingly being steered by these collective subconscious forces. Scarily enough, it is not... I mean, there are conspiracies involved, for sure, but most of the conspirators are just these naive fools, these world betterers, or Weltverbesserer. They're not... A lot of them, like the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, etc., don't even realize what they're doing. They are just naive. A lot of them belong to these New Age-type religions that emerged in 1844 with the Age of Aquarius, that teach all this nonsense about how, identity, nationality, race, culture are the cause of all our problems, and we all have to unite under one faith, etc. None of that is true. It's all very destructive. When you really get to the heart of it, it's being steered by an animal in disguise, a camouflaged predator. Now, I think it's pertinent on this program that I discuss the origins of Islam, because a lot of people might wonder to themselves, I have stated, and the Playaran extraterrestrials have stated, etc., that Muhammad was actually a real prophet. Now the question is, if he was a real prophet, and in fact he did have these provable, real good teachings and humane teachings, why is it that in history he is portrayed as some kind of warlord and mass killer, etc.? The reason is that that history about him was written about 125 years after his death, and it ascribes things to him that he simply did not do. Even the traditional Muslim history of Muhammad is false. He did not go around killing people. He might have been involved in one or two skirmishes in which self-defense was necessary, but he certainly didn't go around torturing and killing like they say he did. Now the question is, why would they ascribe such barbarism to their own prophet? Supposedly that would be proof that it's an authentic account. Well, actually the reason why is because the successors of Muhammad, the so-called caliphs, wanted to justify their own barbaric behavior. It's as simple as that. I'll read off some facts of history about how this came about. First of all, the first record of Muhammad's death appears more than a century after that date. So Muhammad was not a very well-known figure in his lifetime. When he was alive, he did not lead hundreds of thousands of pilgrims and all that. He was actually an obscure prophet who mostly communicated in a small circle of friends and acquaintances. He advised his tribe, but his tribe, first of all, did not immediately convert to Islam. His tribe were still a mixture, a syncretic pagan Christian tribe. The Quraysh to which he belonged, the tribe, were actually, they belonged to a mixture between Gnosticism, Christianity, and Arab paganism, and it took them over 100 years to convert to Islam. This means that, quite simply, the Rashidun Caliphate did not exist as it is said to have existed. Originally, Caliph only means a successor, somebody that Muhammad had tasked with, or was tasked with the mission of spreading his teaching, not a warlord tasked with the mission of conquering. His tribe and the Arabs did in fact conquer around that time, but the reasons why are not because Muhammad commanded them to. In fact, at the time they were still predominantly Gnostic Christian / pagan. They were divided between these two different tendencies, but they in general were syncretic Christians. Just like you see syncretic Christianity in the Caribbean, right now in Africa, etc. That's what they were. The Arabs at that time in his tribe were syncretic Christian pagans. But you don't have to, well, I'll list off some facts, some more facts that show this is the case. In the mid-630s, there's a reference to a living Arab prophet armed with a sword. All right, that's the one reference supposedly about Muhammad. I mean, keep in mind, this is just a name as well. Just because somebody's named Muhammad does not, or even an Arab prophet, right, doesn't mean that it was him. Just like at the time of Jesus, there were other prophets going around in Israel. Those conquered by the Arabs in the 7th century never even mentioned Islam, Muhammad, or the Quran until much later. They referred to their conquerors as Ishmaelites, Saracens, Muhajirun, and Hagarians, but never as Muslims, because they were not predominantly Muslim yet. They were actually still mostly Christian, pagan syncretics. The coins and inscriptions of the Arab conquerors do not mention Islam or the Quran for the first 60 years after the conquests. Mentions of Muhammad are ambiguous, right? So it's not even clear if it's actually referring to him, and twice his name appears next to a cross, meaning that most likely this was not Muhammad ibn Abdullah, but actually somebody else named Muhammad who was a Christian. The Quran in its present form was not distributed until the 650s according to Orthodox account, but that's actually quite flawed. The Quran is not even mentioned by the Arabs, Christians, or Jews in the region until the early 8th century, so until over 100 years after Muhammad's death, or around 100 years, right? The Arabs constructed a public building with an inscription headed by a cross during the reign of the Caliph Muawiyah. So during the reign, so-called, of the Caliph, this wasn't a reign, right? The so-called Caliph was actually either a warlord who was renamed the Caliph in post-diction. They were going back and post hoc saying, okay, the guy's now was a Caliph. In reality, he was either a warlord or his name and acts were ascribed to another warlord who was not him. Remember, the actual caliphs were just successors to Muhammad in the sense of being tasked with the mission of spreading his teaching, but some warlords were just rewritten as caliphs later on. For example, it's questionable whether Omar himself was actually a caliph, given that he started out as a great enemy of Muhammad and was notoriously aggressive and belligerent against Muhammad. It's possible that he really was. I don't know. There's not enough evidence to know either way whether Omar really converted to Islam or not. But the fact of the matter is that the guy, that many of the caliphs certainly were not caliphs, or deeds of other people were ascribed to them in order to justify the later actions of the Abbasid Caliphate, which was really the one that founded the current religion of Islam, not Muhammad himself. But we'll get into that later. Coins and inscriptions indicating Islamic beliefs, and the first mentions of Muhammad as a prophet of Islam emerged in the reign of Caliph Abdul Malik in the 690s. Now, this is really where the Quran begins, is with the Caliph Abdul Malik. Basically what happened is just like Constantine, eventually the Arabs had too much division in their own society because of all these different pagan cults, these different allegiances, these different tribes, and the fact that Christianity was kind of a loose connector between these different groups. But they wanted to get rid of these pagan allegiances in order to create a single Arab society, a single Islamic society, just like Constantine did with Christianity. It was not something Muhammad told them to do. It is something which they did, which he prophesied they would do, but he did not tell them to do it. Understand the difference there. I mean, John, the Revelator, prophesied the events of Revelation. That doesn't mean he's telling us to create the B666, right? So, all right, let's get back into this. At the same time, Arabic superseded Syrian and Greek as the dominant language of the empire. So, clearly Abdul Malik is the one who really made these reforms and began the unification of Arab culture and the creation of an Arab-based empire. Abdul Malik claimed to have been the one to have collected the Quran sayings into one volume, contradicting Islamic tradition that this had been accomplished 4 years earlier by Uthman. So Uthman did not actually create the Quran or collect it. Abdul Malik collected the sayings into one volume. Now here's the actual origin of the Quran. Muhammad had written down bits and pieces of the teaching of the spirit that he had taught, which later you can see in the PDF Goblet of Truth. Look up gobletoftruth.pdf. It's available from figu.org. The original teaching of Muhammad is Goblet of Truth. Muhammad had written down bits and pieces of his teaching. Right? He was actually literate, first of all. He was not illiterate. The one reference to him being illiterate in the Quran is the word ummi, which actually means of a clan. It doesn't mean illiterate at all. It actually means the clansman prophet. And because of some other Jewish prophecy, and God knows, the Jews have so many ridiculously falsified things in their religion that nothing that they say can be entirely trusted. I mean, they say that Jesus worshipped a brick. All right, he did not worship a brick. It's total nonsense. So let's get back to Muhammad. Muhammad had written down bits and pieces of his teaching on scraps of paper, whatever he had around, parchment, mostly, right, whatever the case, he wrote down little bits and pieces of the teaching, right? He didn't put them into one book himself. He gave these, as well as oral instructions about how to put them together, to his cousin Ali. But because Ali was not just literate, but had at his disposal the ability to copy by hand and distribute this teaching. So what Ali did is he had people under his management write down and copy by hand these little bits and pieces that later would become the Quran. However, Ali himself was still influenced by Christianity, to which he belonged, so he changed some words and information himself in the early Quran. For example, he changed the word, which was at that time Allah, which means the enlightenment or the illumination, right? From the word dha'a, that's the ancient pronunciation of it, right? Now it's da'a, but dha is the original pronunciation of dad, which is a characteristic letter of Arabic that sounds like an L, right? That's the reason why Allah is pronounced with an emphatic L. It's because it originally is not Allah at all, it's Allah. That's another interesting fact there, is that actually Muhammad did never use the word Allah himself. He avoided using the word God to refer to creation. He used various different words, meaning creation, formation, destiny, enlightenment, etc. For example, al-Khaliq. Al-Khaliq means the creation. That's the main word he used, not Allah. Again, Allah should be Allah. Why is it pronounced Allah? Because it was not originally Allah at all, it was Allah. But I'll get to that later, and maybe in a different program. The main point is Ali changed things himself. All right? So his version of the Quran is also not reliable. But it gets worse, because he then gave these bits and pieces that he had been distributing around to the Arabs, these bits and pieces of Muhammad's teaching. He gave a collection of all these different bits and pieces to Abdul Malik, who then had these sent to a man in Iraq, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who put the pieces together into a single book. He was the first person to edit these, the Quran. Yes, quote-unquote, edited the Quran in the 690s. The governor of Iraq, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, edited the Quran. In other words, he had other people edit it for him. He probably didn't do the work himself. And distributed it to various provinces according to multiple hadiths. Also something the traditional account attributes much earlier to Uthman. So, the Quran in its current form is not the original teaching of Muhammad. It has been falsified. That's why there are questionable passages in the Quran. That's why there are portions of the Quran that do not agree with the general tone and logic of the whole, is because some of the passages were changed either because of misunderstanding, because of influences from other religions like Christianity or paganism, and also mainly just because of the influences from the prevailing barbaric culture. The same thing that happened when Christian emperors wanted to justify their barbaric mass murders, like Justinian. They falsified the teachings of Jesus. Similarly, however, these guys actually wrote down the first Quran and falsified the teachings of Muhammad. Now, the Quran is not, I'm saying, an entirely unreliable document. There's still a lot of the original teaching in there. But something else that's happened is a lot of the ancient words are now misunderstood. Like Muhammad used the word to know for certain, which now means to believe. That is not the correct meaning. It means to know for certain. He said, blessed are those who know about the unseen. Now people interpret that as meaning, blessed are those who believe in the unseen. Completely different meaning. Completely different and disastrously different. But the same sort of thing happened with Christianity as well. Needless to say, also with Judaism. Now, some Islamic traditions date certain practices such as the recitation of the Quran during mosque prayers from the directives of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. All right, so apparently also a lot of the traditional rituals of Islam do not date to Muhammad himself. They might be based on his recommendations, but they are not directly from him. Muhammad certainly recommended meditation and prayer, but I doubt that he recommended a very ritualistic and rigid system of prayer, such as is currently performed by Muslims, 5 times a day in a very ritualistic fashion. Now, not that that's negative. Of course, it's ideal that everyone performs some kind of meditation or prayer every day. This is actually very important to psychological health and spiritual well-being. But it's not necessary that it be in an extremely rigid form. Remember that Emmanuel told us to pray just to say, Our Father who art in heaven, etc., and that's also valid. There's no reason why you have to do it in a certain ritual. The first complete biography of Muhammad appeared 125 years after the traditional date of the Prophet's death. All right, so whenever you read stuff like on religion of peace or answering Islam that goes on and on slandering Muhammad as some kind of mass murderer and rapist or whatever, I mean, whatever they call him, I don't necessarily think they say rapist, but they do say like he was a mass murderer and torturer, whatever. All right? It's all nonsense, because the first biography of Muhammad didn't appear until 125 years after he died. All right? So the guy died in 632 AD, and so that means like 757 AD is when the first biography appeared. The material proliferated after the Umayyad dynasty was replaced by the Abbasids. Again, the Abbasid dynasty are the ones who really founded the current form of Islam, and obviously they modified it to fit their political agenda. Just like how Constantine modified Christianity to fit his political agenda, Justinian, and of course now the Catholic Church has just mangled it beyond recognition. They now condone usury, and they're trying to create their own greedy materialistic world empire. Again, totally out of sync, totally out of harmony with the teachings of Emmanuel. But the new dynasty, interestingly enough, accused the Umayyad dynasty of being most irreligious. So apparently the previous dynasty was supposedly irreligious. The early dynasty was bad. Now why? Why would they be bad? Because they didn't agree with all the changes they made, probably. The new biographical details of Muhammad emerged at this time. So him being a warlord, him making big public appearances, none of that stuff happened. There's no evidence for it outside of this biography written 125 years after his death. In reality, just like how they say that Elijah supposedly killed like 300 Baal priests, he didn't kill 300. Okay, maybe he killed a few of them, or had them killed in response to the fact that they were murdering people left and right, and they were totally insane fanatics. But again, it's in defense of other life. Never did a prophet kill people out of a desire to spread their empire. They only killed people if they were a threat to other lives. That's it. Muhammad himself recommended banishment. He did not recommend all the barbaric punishments recommended in the current Quran, such as beheading. In fact, those are questionable translations and interpretations to begin with. Again, beheading, cutting off hands, mutilation, he condemned all that kind of stuff. But that all that kind of punishment, tracing back to Hammurabi, etc., that sort of thing was prevalent in the Middle East for hundreds or thousands of years before, and they didn't want to change their ways, even though he told them it was not the ideal way. And there's perfectly logical reasons why you should not kill a captive, why you shouldn't mutilate somebody. It's that they're not going to learn from their mistakes if they die. Simple as that. They're not going to learn from their mistakes if they die. And there's even more worse reasons. Like if somebody's possessed by a demonic force and they die, that force just goes on to a new body. If they stay alive, the genie's trapped in the bottle. You understand? Don't kill people. I mean, you have to kill them sometimes, right? You have to kill sometimes for defense. But when you kill somebody for no reason, when you just go around killing all your enemies, killing people of other religions, it's totally illogical. In fact, in the original teaching in Goblet of Truth, it states that the worst among human beings are the mass murderers, the immoderate murderers. All right, the ones who just kill without measure. Now, the other thing is that Mecca was not really a center of trade and pilgrimage as claimed by canonical Islamic accounts. Of course, that also puts into question the idea that Muhammad had lots of followers. And of course, he didn't initially have lots of followers, because nobody coming out with a true and revolutionary teaching would instantly have lots of followers. It just doesn't happen that way. People are resistant to the truth. So again, he was only an obscure prophet, not well known in his day, who at most advised other members of his own tribe, and it was these, who were still largely Christians or syncretic Christian pagans, who committed the acts of war attributed to Muhammad, not Muhammad himself. That's the explanation. The reason why they continue believing this is that Shiites are descended from the lineage supposedly of Ali. Really, ultimately, however, they were Jews who converted to Islam originally. And the Arabs maintained a lot of their old pagan and barbaric culture. So also Sunni Muslims have a corrupted version of the teaching of Muhammad. It's as simple as that. Of course, there's a lot of value in there, and it's not all false, but those little corruptions, the slightest errors, result in catastrophic effects eventually. The slightest heresy can eventually become a wildfire, just as we see with Christianity going around destroying other cultures during. So, I'll be back tomorrow to discuss this stuff more. Check out my website at MatthewDeagle.com. Thanks for listening to Real Astrology.